better efforts prevailed between us, and he has hooked up with me here on the show. So let's welcome him on right now. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome Dan Roodt, who is an Afrikaner, an author, a publisher, and a commentator onto the Dino Costa show. Mr. Roodt, thanks for your efforts. I appreciate it. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Good morning or good evening in your time.
There we go. Yes. And so it's 4 o'clock down in South Africa right now, and as you peer outside the window, what kind of weather do you have down there right now?
Well, it's pretty dark because it's winter now, and yeah, and we've had a bit of a cold spell, so I think it's going to be 0 degrees today. That's 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit in your language. But it's very, it's very sunny weather, so there are no clouds or anything like that. So at midday it warms up again a little bit, but we've had a bit of a cold spell, unusual for South Africa.
Right. Well, I'll also let people know that you have called me on your cell phone, and so we'll try to make this work here with the reception and whatnot. So far, so good. Dan, as you know, I contacted you over the weekend after reading a story that was published on July the 10th, and I have spoken about this previously on my show in terms of so many of the, I guess I'll call them similarities in regard to what I call almost like reverse apartheid that seems to be going on here in the United States. And you're in full knowledge of all of the things that we are seeing and the things that are being done here in the States. And knowing what went on in South Africa many years ago, and it continues to this very day right now, your column, and we'll talk about certain excerpts and some of the things that you said in this column, but you see some very eerie symbolism, some very eerie similarities between what South Africa went through and what the United States is going through right now, yes?
Yes, that's correct. Because, there was an international movement against us called the Anti-Apartheid Movement, and it was financed by other states, especially in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Netherlands, and even Canada. They gave this terrorist movement, which, they were also assisted by the Soviet Union and East Germany. They gave them hundreds of millions of dollars to actually overthrow the South African government. And it worked beautifully because they also had a lot of publicity and media support from various left-wing journalists all over the Western countries. And eventually, South Africa was in such a corner that they destabilized the situation internally by means of protests and extreme violence. Also attacking conservative blacks who didn't want to go along with this revolutionary movement. In fact, they called that the People's War. And that's the way they did it. And the similarity with the United States now is that, Black Lives Matter is very much similar to the anti-apartheid movement. It's also being funded by various left-wing organizations, including, of course, some of the major corporations in the US. And it has a lot of media and propaganda support from your more liberal and left-wing outlets.
So anyone who would make the claim that, hey, listen, I know that America has never been as racially polarized or as racially controversial as it is now, but then to make the other assumption that if we're not careful, we could see a complete replication in many ways here in America that South Africa went through all those years ago. This is not anything that you would consider to be hyperbolic in any way. You actually believe there is a legitimacy to such a thought if we're not careful here.
Yes, definitely. What we went through, the revolution or regime change that you could call here, exactly the same thing could happen in the US, in my opinion. I was walking around, I was going on a morning walk once, and then it struck me that it's not about demographics and it's not about numbers. Because even though the whites are a minority in South Africa, they've been here for 400 years and so on, they created this state, and the blacks were not really involved in government. They hadn't been involved for a long time. So it wasn't really the fact that we were outnumbered which caused the change. It was something else. It was this combination of terrorism, violence, protest, and a media campaign. So in the US, even though the European Americans are in the majority, they could end up being so delegitimized as a population by this propaganda that they would have to abdicate from politics almost altogether. They would have to accept that they would be ruled either by blacks or Hispanics or a combination of the two, and that they themselves, being so racist and having been morally castigated and stigmatized. Yes, the process, what's going on in the US is exactly the same as happened here. We were stigmatized, and the media all over, not only in the USA, but also all over the world, in Europe, and even in the Far East, they are stigmatizing Americans. And that process will lead, then, if it sticks, this stigmatization, and if it goes far enough, it will lead to a situation where you would not be able to assert yourselves politically anymore, where you would have to accept whatever Black Lives Matter says. Even, it doesn't matter how unreasonable it is, you will just have to be silent, and you will have to accept whatever they propose. And of course, if the Democratic Party comes into power, then they will help a lot of these progressive or extremist groups in the US to actually get into positions of power. And then by that time, you will have had your South African style revolution.
There were so many great paragraphs in the piece that compelled me to reach out to you to come on the show. And that stigmatization that you talk about, the demonization, the marginalization is occurring at warp speed here in this country in what I think millions of people find to be very, very scary ways. You mentioned that the ANC and the overthrow of the previous government in South Africa was financed greatly by external forces. And as you mentioned in one of the paragraphs of this story here, you note that major tech companies in the U.S. have now pledged an estimated $1 to $2 billion to Black Lives Matter. And then you note that you're reminded that a few $100 million was dished out by Sweden to South Africa's aforementioned ANC, and that helped to topple the old government despite the powerful military and police that was in place at that time. And you mentioned that during the 1980s, the last South African president to offer any kind of resistance to the Marxists and the Africanists was P.W. Botha, and he coined the term total onslaught to describe the offensive against the white people in South Africa at that time, which included, among other things, cross-border terrorism, inciting riots and sedation, economic and financial sanctions, and most important, propaganda. All of those things are occurring in our midst right now here in the United States. And as all of this was occurring back then, did you see, we're also seeing a cultural cleansing, Dan, in this country right now that is really humiliating to the United States of America. Did you also see this occurring back then? Was there a cultural cleansing in South Africa that took place as this new regime marched into office?
Well, yes, we did see some of it, before they came to power, in that they also attacked our history, and they rewrote the history completely. There was a group of explicitly Marxist historians. They called themselves the Revisionist School of History. They were at the universities. They were being funded by our government, in fact, but they were at some of these left-wing universities, and they rewrote our history completely to cast the whites in the light of being the criminals of history and the blacks their victims. And then when the ANC came to power, we saw exactly, well, we are seeing it now even, the tearing down of statues, removal of statues, renaming of streets, renaming of towns and cities. So we are kind of concurrently with the US experiencing exactly the same thing that you are going through currently, with this sort of cultural onslaught on your history and your symbols and your names and your heroes. All of that is taking place right here and has been taking place for a number of years now in South Africa. So there's another big parallel. It's almost as if there's a global process regarding the delegitimization of Western and European history in favor of these rising third world populations, Africans and African Americans. You also saw, I think I mentioned in the article as well, that Africa, the other African countries, although they weren't up to much financially or as far as logistics were concerned, they did actually at the United Nations pledge support for the ANC terrorist movement. And already the African Union, the organization that regroups all the African countries, they have passed a resolution against the United States regarding Black Lives Matter, and at the UN you have the same process. The UN, the United Nations, is also attacking America. So there's an international concerted, campaign against America, and then specifically the European Americans.
It's Dan Roodt. He joins me from his home in South Africa. If you got a question or comment, of course, send it my way. Talk to Dino@gmail.com, and I'll get it on to Mr. Roodt. We all of us who are aware and pay attention to these things, Dan, we're aware of what can only be described as a white genocidal movement that has been underway for years and years in South Africa, and the amount of slaughtering of farmers, white farmers in South Africa, that the world doesn't seem to be paying attention to. I know that the president here, Donald Trump, has made some overtures about some things in South Africa, paying mild attention to it, but as a South African yourself, knowing what's going on down there and what has been going on down there for years and years and years, what are your own personal reflections and observations of all of the things that have been going on down in your country, and the world seems to be turning a blind eye to it with no one taking it seriously? And certainly you can't rely on police forces that are down there because they're so corrupt and they're so tied into the ANC. And give me some of your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, as you said, it is tantamount to a white genocide, because we've got the whole legal system has been turned against us. There are so many laws against us. In fact, a former leader of the liberal opposition, the Democratic Alliance, she tweeted about 2 weeks ago that there were more racial laws now in South Africa than ever under the previous government, and even say in the US, during the time of the Jim Crow laws. We've got so many laws restricting economic participation by whites, ownership of companies by whites. Any company now has to have a majority black ownership, even if it's a family business run by a white family. In order to do business, they have to get majority black ownership, and especially business with major corporations or with the state, they have to be majority black owned. And you've even got billboards, where black businesses advertise, where they say 100% black owned and so on. You've got the same thing in the US, I think, here and there. But then there's the violence against us, yes, and the police simply turn a blind eye. There are all these kind of gangs and groups, and they operate almost in military fashion. There are 5 or 6 of them in a group, and they attack you at 4 o'clock in the morning. A friend of mine was attacked like that. It was the second time that they actually attacked him. He's an elderly man, about 75. And unfortunately, they survived the attack, but and that was in town, or on a small estate just outside town. And they immediately moved out of there into a security complex. But and a friend of mine was killed a lady of 50. She was killed in the northern Transvaal. She was beaten to death with a hammer, and I think she was raped as well before that. So this, everybody knows people who have been killed, who have been attacked like this. And although the government doesn't explicitly use its own personnel, like the military or the police, to do that, they create a climate, this antagonistic climate, through their constant propaganda from the state media and from some of the liberal media that follow that, where it's seen as the right thing to do to go and attack a white person. And then you've got all these extremists or criminals, and they see it as an opportunity to go and do that. So, in the US, you've also had some pretty extreme attacks, almost racial attacks on European Americans over the last few decades. So, I could see amid this climate And we were also betrayed by our leaders in the early 90s. They promised us that they would negotiate a good deal, and in the end, they just surrendered. So there's that element of the treacherous elite as well, because the elite gets turned first. Because the elite, they don't really suffer under the new system because they've got enough money and in their Swiss bank accounts and wherever to survive any kind of a system. And even the corruption, to some extent, they might benefit from that. If you're a businessman in a corrupt country, then there might be deals you can do with the government, and you can facilitate the money laundering and all that sort of stuff for them. You know, lots of business people here have done that. I mean, there was a case where a small businessman from the Eastern Cape, he was also a member of the ANC party. His name was Gavin Watson. He mounted a whole corrupt operation with the President's Department where he made billions out of that. And eventually, eventually he either committed suicide or he was actually killed in an accident to make it look like a suicide when he drove into a pillar near the airport a few months ago. So, but he was supposed to go and testify before a commission into all these corrupt activities. Yeah, so there's definitely this element of the information war, the propaganda campaign. That is the cutting edge of this whole revolution. It's a new, as I explained in my article, it's a new kind of revolution. And it was first tested in South Africa and found to be successful, you know, to be a successful method to overthrow a country and to take over the entire system. It was first tested here, and they're now pushing for the same thing in America. We've got all the signs there that through the propaganda, they want to conquer the United States and then, you know, rule it and then loot it from the inside. And the US is the wealthiest country in the world, so there's a lot of loot to be had there. And lots of people are interested in getting to it.
Well, Dan, I agree with everything that you've said, and I've, you know, for years I have been talking about this movement. It was an undercurrent that was a little bit more subliminal in the past, but it's out in the open right now, and it's a raging wildfire, and there doesn't seem to be enough water in the world to put out this fire. And there are some parallels between what happened in South Africa and what is currently going on here. And you point out many of these things, obviously, in the column. And one of the things that I tried to make a point to my audience as well is that, you know, I don't, on my show, throw things out there against the wall and simply hope that they stick. I'm not reckless. I'm not irresponsible with my commentary when it comes to this kind of stuff. And especially in regard to something as polarizing and as, you know, flammable, if you will, incendiary as when you talk about race and you talk about racial relations. I've often said on the show that the biggest lie that this country, the United States, has ever been told is on full display right now, and that is that the white man in this country has done everything that they can to keep black America down, when I've also made the point that white America throughout the decades has done more for black America in this country than black America has ever done for itself. And again, I think it's important for me to note that it's my feeling that there are many, many more well-meaning, constructive, law-abiding black people in our country here in the States than are part of the black radical movement. But saying that, you mentioned something here that I read before, and I'll re-reference it again here in a second. You know, it just seems, Dan, that facts, established, inarguable, indisputable facts, simply don't matter. You wrote, one of the most obvious ideas that is being promulgated out there is that whites are racist, blacks are the victims. And you also say this is even when statistics show, as is in the case with your country in South Africa, certainly it's the case here in the United States, statistics, raw data, irrefutable information show that whites in America are overwhelmingly the victims of black violence versus the other way around. As I've said chapter and verse on this show throughout the last couple of weeks, ever since this whole thing started, Dan, we don't have a white problem in America. We don't have anything closely resembling a white supremacist problem in America. What we have in America is a black violence issue. What we have in America is a severe black-on-white crime issue. What we have here is a black-on-black violence issue in America. And yet these things are conveniently yet predictably swept under the carpet. Nobody wants to hear about it because as long as you continue to tell the lie, as long as you continue to use manipulation and propaganda through the media, you will continue to convince people that what is being reported by the mainstream news is in fact factual, and this is the story that people are going to buy without referring to the statistics and the facts, which should tell them a completely and totally different story.
Yes, you're perfectly right there. That they are going to manipulate the statistics and, you know, present it as if there's a problem of white racism. In fact, there have been many studies in the US showing that, you know, well, most black people have never been victims of any racist incident in the US, yet they believe that there is this invisible racism out there and that they can see little signs of it every now and again. There was even, I saw a black and white documentary movie made by Craig Bodeker once in the US, and where he asked a black man who was in a disco and he was dancing, and then a white man said, "Yes, you're a good dancer," and he thought that was racist. You know, so the racism becomes so subtle that it's interpreted, anything can be interpreted as racism. And then, of course, it's all blown up. Any form of racial incident is blown up out of all proportion. You know, such as this whole George Floyd incident. I mean, it was just an unfortunate occurrence, and we don't really know yet exactly what happened there. But it was blown out of all proportion, and, you know, the almost accidental death of one man, you know, set alight the United States. And that was because it was driven by the media and by the left-wing groups and the Black Lives Matter and all of these left-wing groups funded by some of these left-wing billionaires you've got there in the United States. Incidentally, George Soros, he's still very active in South Africa. He was also active in the 1980s to finance some of the left-wing initiatives in South Africa. So, you know, there you've got another parallel. Same people even involved.
Yeah. That doesn't surprise me at all, Soros. And you're right, he's funding and underwriting much of what we're seeing here today. You write, if the United States gets a Democrat president and Senate, it will be nearly game over for whites. Whites could then face what we in South Africa face: exclusion from jobs, government contracts, and from majority ownership of companies. This has got to be a terrifying thought to the people in this country. And but again, I go back to the fact that there are so many people who just fail to see through all of this, don't understand what the end game is going to look like, and as they continue to just promote all of the wrong kinds of things and tear down statues and culturally cleanse our society. As I've said, Dan, on more than one occasion here, it's like they just want the country total, lock, stock, and barrel, and they want to start over from year zero in America. And if things continue along this current trajectory, you know what? I can see that happening in a very short period of time. I really can.
Yes, it does happen very quickly. You know, I could still remember in the mid-1980s, even the leftists in South Africa thought that the old government would almost rule forever. And within a matter of 4 or 5 years, they were overthrown, or they were put into a position where they supposedly had to negotiate. And once the negotiation started, it was just a complete capitulation. So it can happen very quickly. You know, we also had, well, maybe you know, one could write a whole book about all the ways these sort of revolutions happened. Also in the Portuguese colonies in Africa, in Mozambique and Angola. In Angola, the Portuguese were actually winning the war against the Marxist guerrillas on the other side. But then they had also a change of government in Portugal, a kind of a revolution. I think they call it the Coronation Revolution there, where you had Marxists and socialists coming into power. And then they betrayed their own army in Angola. And within a short period, within a couple of months, people literally had to flee the country. The Portuguese who were born there and grown up there, the Portuguese were in Angola longer than Americans in America. They were there for 500 years. I mean, they colonized that country in the 1500s. So, yeah, this thing, it can happen very quickly, and once it gets going and it has got momentum, the changes, you know, they can almost be overnight. And, you know, the thing that I'm hinting about in the article also is that you've got, even though European Americans are a majority in their own country, in the world, they are a minority. And you've got this demographic pressure from the globe, from Latin America, from Africa. You know, Africa, that's another story that I wrote about 2 years ago, I think. Africa is going through a huge population explosion at the moment. I mean, the population is doubling every 20, 25 years. They're going to go from 1.2 billion to 2.5 billion, and then to probably 4.5 or 5 billion after that. So where are these people going to go? You know, in Africa, most of the infrastructure sits in South Africa, and we can't even cope with the population here. So the rest of the Africans, there's no infrastructure in the rest of Africa to support that population, and they will want to move. And if the Democrats in the US create the open door for them, they will be there tomorrow. It will be like, you know, I was talking to somebody in Poland the other day about also an interview about the French author Jean Raspail. You remember that book of his from the 1970s, The Camp of the Saints? It will be something like that. That will happen. You know, there will be this swarm of third world immigrants wanting to go to the US. They've seen it in all the Hollywood movies. They want a suburban house and 2 cars and a shopping center and so on, things that they don't have in their own country. Yeah, and they will definitely move. Well, once the notion of population migration is accepted, and there is a lot of propaganda, international propaganda now, in favor of free movement of people all over the world. You know, of migration being a natural kind of. Yeah, it's something completely natural. So if you know, there shouldn't be borders between countries, and people should just be allowed to move. And yes, and then you will, within maybe a decade or 2, you will find yourself in exactly the same situation as we are in, as being a minority in your own country. And then you will be dictated to by the majority. And the majority won't be as nice as white Americans are towards blacks, you know, providing welfare for them, lots of taxes and education, healthcare, and so on. They won't give you anything. They will just take from you. They will nationalize. Well, they will take your property. They will take your land, your house, everything. I mean, there are these radical groups in South Africa. They don't want to leave us anything. They want to just take all your property and punish you and discriminate against you. I mean, they are racist in the true sense, but the left doesn't see it that way.
Well, you know, you mentioned that they're racist in the truest of senses, and I would agree with you. And we see a lot of that going on in this country with the radical movement that's underway currently. But you know, I was also thinking that, Dan, what we're talking about here, I mean, we're hitting on a host of different issues and items. We're talking about economics, we're talking about social economics, social living, we're talking about politics, we're talking about relationships, we're talking about interracial relationships. Nothing that we're talking about here, nothing that I've said, no question I've asked you, and no response that you've given me up to this point in time, in my way of thinking objectively, can be looked upon as something that someone could term or apply the word racist or bigoted or anything like that. Yet, the flip side of that coin says that under the parameters with which we live now, in this politically correct society, Dan, that the entire time we've been on the phone with each other here tonight, doing this live on the air, that what we have spoken about, though not racist in orientation in any way, shape, or form, is taboo, is not to be discussed, is to remain hidden from view and not exposed and not publicly spoken about. And therefore, because we have spoken about it so openly and candidly, even though not racist in ideology, what we're talking about, there are so many who would apply the word racist to many of the things that you and I have spoken about so far here on the show tonight.
Yes, you're perfectly right. And of course, there's a huge amount of censorship now all over the world. You know, in the old Soviet Union, if you said the wrong thing, when they would just send you to Siberia, to the Gulag, to one of those prison camps. And it's almost as if we are on our way there again, because as soon as you deviate from the official ideology, then you are considered to be an outcast, and they use this term racist, this very loaded term. You know, the French politician Marine Le Pen, she once used the term semantic war as well, which I find quite useful. There's a semantic war going on, a war of words, a war of meaning. And, you know, this word racist is a weapon in this war. And if they can brand you as a racist, then they have neutralized you. And that is what they are doing all the time in this country too. Lots and lots of times. There's a singer here called Steve Hofmeyr, you know, who is also a defender of our interests and of the people who listen to his music. But they are constantly going after him and trying to brand him as a racist, even though he's very popular among black people too. You know, I've been with him where black people would come up and ask for his autograph. So they don't perceive him as racist, the average black person out there. But the media and these propagandists, they do. And they are going to try and brand him, you know, as a racist. So we have to overcome this kind of censorship and do it through alternative media and, you know, neutralize those sorts of campaigns and attacks on us. I've even been in a situation where, you know, I was fraudulently interviewed by the Daily Show in the US. They came to me and they took hours of footage, and afterwards they would rearrange some of the answers that I'd given, and they would put the wrong answer to a question that they posed, you know, and it looked, and they asked me, for example, are you a racist? And I said no. And then they would ask me, and half an hour later, do you live in Johannesburg? And I would say yes, and they would take the yes from that question and put it in front of the racist one. You know, they are completely unscrupulous, these people. They will do anything, they will commit any fraud and whatever to cast you in a bad light, because they are fighting a war against you, a semantic war. That's what's going on.
And they don't care about the rules either.
No, for them there are no rules.
No rules whatsoever. Manipulation, deceit, deception, whatever it takes to get the job done, they will do that. Dan, I can't thank you enough for your time on the show tonight, especially for joining me at such an early time down there in South Africa. It has been a pleasure, sir, to speak with you tonight, and I appreciate your candidness and your ability to articulate a lot of what you talked about in the column. And I wish you nothing but the very best. Continue to speak the truth. Stay safe down there, and don't be surprised if I give you a call again and we get together again and we do this. And more than anything, thanks for trying so hard to get on the show when it appeared for a little while like we weren't going to be able to get you on tonight. I certainly appreciate that.
No, it's my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me, Dino. And yes, and keep up the good work you are doing on your side. Thank you very much.
I will. You got it. Thank you, Dan.
Goodbye.